a lot of people are they're focused on more is it synthetic or is it organic? It's never what the actual product is. And I think that's where carbon is fascinating for a lot of people, because they start to realize that these inputs are so important to the plant itself, and that they're able to do it in a way that they're used to with bottled nutrients, so to speak. So it's not so intimidating like some of the organic, inputs are for a lot of people.
Yeah, and the thing with salts, and really, I guess you could say like conventional fertilizers that are based on technology that maybe has been around for a couple of decades now. The thing that goes on there is we didn't really understand the importance of carbon as an element for plant growth before all of this other stuff was figured out. And so what ended up happening is, salt-based conventional fertilizers got scaled up, and we started putting a bunch of these ingredients on plants that don't really make up a majority of their biomass. I mean, all the NPK, CalMag, silica, et cetera, that makes up less than 10% of what the plant is. And the remainder is water and carbon. And obviously, when you dehydrate the plants, you're left with mostly carbon by weight. It could be over 50% of the dry weight of the plant. So there's been a little bit of a paradigm shift as the science has advanced, and researchers have been looking at, what is it that gives plants their ability to resist disease pressures, or to taste better, or to be more nutrient dense, or just more flavorful, and maybe there's better smells that come out of it, stronger aromatics. The answer 100% of the time is carbon. There's carbon-based molecules that plants are in the business of making and then exporting out to various sites like trichome heads, for example. And that's really where they accumulate. And a lot of times people that grow crops, regardless of what they are, they're looking for carbon-based molecules. So it's important to figure out how to feed that to the plants. Historically, the way to do it is to create a sealed flowering room and have an environment that's controlled so you can regulate the amount of CO2 levels that go into it. Because as I'm sure you can imagine, like on an open field outside, you can't necessarily increase the concentration of CO2 to the plants. It's in the air, so it's going to get dispersed. So that's been the real struggle, is we can put the NPK, et cetera, inside of the water, and we can give that to plants in varying quantities, a little bit more, a little bit less. But how do we deliver more carbon to the plants? The interface has always been through the air, through a gaseous interaction. But I think it's wise to have people start thinking about how you can feed carbon in the feed water for plants, because that can make a huge difference overall.
And when you say that, like when you're referring to trying to now conquer or understand the physics of how carbon interacts with the plant, is that what you're describing right there?
Yeah, I mean, it's more on, I guess, like carbon would be a larger element, and the physics-based side of it looks at the smaller things like the electrons that are orbiting around that carbon and how the electrons kind of get moved around, because that's really what it is. I mean, when plants photosynthesize, the very first thing that happens is there's photons from the sun that come in on a particular wavelength, and they interact with electrons that are in chlorophyll. And that interaction causes the electrons in chlorophyll to be elevated. And depending on the energy transfer you can get, basically you guys are familiar with the tuning fork, right? The analogy of a tuning fork, you can just like hit one tuning fork and then, a couple of inches or maybe a foot away, the other tuning fork starts responding to, but they have to be in resonance with each other. Otherwise, this doesn't work. Photosynthesis is actually kind of very similar to that. There is this resonance transfer of energy where plants get excited by the energy of the sun coming in, and they pass that excitation energy along. So it's less specifically about carbon as an element and more about how energy flows through plants. And one of the hubs for that energy flow is definitely carbon. Is actually the central hub of energy flow in plants. Just taking CO2 out of the air requires a huge amount of power from the sun. And plants are the only organisms that are doing this, right? Microbes and fungi don't photosynthesize. They can't generate carbon molecules out of the air like plants can. So in a lot of ways, unpacking the physics of how plants are doing this kind of gives me the impression that plants are quantum scale particle decelerators. They're really just slowing down photons that move at the speed of light. Photons don't weigh anything, yet plants produce billions of tons of biomass. So if that's not an example of something out of nothing, then I don't know what is.
Well, does the molecular weight and the the state of oxidation kind of affect the uptake then of how this works? Because essentially, I think the biggest argument people have for clean synthetic nutrients, so to speak, so bottle-based nutrients, is the crop steering side. Like we were just talking about a minute ago. They can push their plants. They can get the big yield. They can get more cannabinoids. They can take what would be this and turn it into a Goliath.
Mhm.
Is that something that carbon as its own, as it's like the molecular level are you able to do that on the same level, or is it something that will naturally, you kind of have to let the plant absorb it as it takes it?
That's a great question. I think there's two parts to it. One is the molecular weight, like how big of a molecule are we dealing with? Most of the time when we're dealing with conventional ingredients, they happen to be very, very low molecular weight compounds, like a calcium nitrate, for example. It's not that big of a molecule. And even so, just to be clear, the salts themselves, oftentimes they come in a hydrated form. So even if you buy a bagged salt, it's not 100% bagged salt. It's going to have water inside of it. You can buy magnesium sulfate at the store. Chances are it's magnesium sulfate heptahydrate, which means that there's 7 molecules of water for every one of magnesium sulfate, right? So even when we buy bagged salts, there's still water inside of it. There has to be water. It's not anhydrous. You can get anhydrous stuff. It's a little bit more dangerous to work with, but the idea basically is that when you dissolve these low molecular weight compounds, if they have high solubility, like most of the nitrates do, they get entered into plant tissue very rapidly. Because for plants, they don't have teeth. They can't chew through stuff in the roots. They produce acids to guide the digestion process of minerals in the soil. And then once those minerals are solubilized and pulled into the plant, now it's become available for them to actually process. Depending on what element is being processed, you have varying energy needs. Nitrate is one of the most energy intensive forms of fertilizer for a plant to process. It can take about 25% of all of the energy coming in from the sun in order to process nitrates that only make up about 1 to 3% of the plant's biomass. Maybe 3 to 5% you'll get if you do like a leaf tissue analysis and you're really crop steering the plants hard. But at the end of the day, nobody's growing plants for chlorophyll, unless they're growing green tea and matcha in Japan, in which case it is useful. But by and large, there's very few examples of instances where you want to crop steer plants to produce chlorophyll, because that nitrogen sink right there automatically means that there's less reduction power or less energy available for the plants to make carbon-based molecules. Look at it this way too. CO2 in the air has the O2 molecule, right? Nitrate is NO3. The thing that both of them have in common is the extra oxygen. It's the CO2 and the NO3. In both cases, the O2 and the O3 kind of have to get cleaved off and worked away from the equation. In the case of nitrates, they become amino acids or ammoniacal forms of nitrogen, which is NH4. And then there's this organic acid skeleton, typically exported from mitochondria, that gets stitched onto it. But the point is basically like the plants are in the business of taking energy from the sun and saying, I need to break the pesky oxygen away from the nitrogen because I don't need the oxygen. I need the nitrogen. That takes an insane amount of power. Same thing with CO2. So now if I give you guys, let's just say I give you guys $10 and I say, can you go to the store and build me a sandwich with 4 ingredients, right? You can't just go and spend $10 on every single ingredient. It doesn't work like that. Plants are also similarly limited. They generate a certain amount of energy. They have like chemical currency. You can measure this in terms of reduction power, by the way, which is the electron flow. And we can get into the oxidation state, which you mentioned, Rob. I'll get to that here in a sec. But plants are taking reduction power that they generate through photosynthesis, and they're sinking that power towards removing oxygens from the nitrate or removing oxygens from the carbon, not both at the same time. Just like I can't spend $10 on this and $10 on that if I only have $10. So really what crop steering comes down to is a balance between what you want your plants to achieve in terms of biomass production, just like the chlorophyll, the leaves, the stalks, the stems. And then on the flip side, the other part about crop steering is making sure you're not drawing too much energy away from the plants and their ability to naturally produce fragrant molecules, aromatic molecules, compounds that are predominantly carbon by weight. Like most of the monoterpenes in nature, alpha-pinene, myrcene, limonene, those are all going to be about 90% carbon by weight. And even the sesquiterpenes, which have more therapeutic and medicinal effects, those will be about 80% carbon by weight. And there's certainly other examples of plants like hops and, hemp and cannabis plants will produce compounds that are about 80% carbon by weight. So really the goal is like, don't feed the plants NPK, because none of that NPK will ever end up in a molecule of CBD or whatever you're looking for. It's always going to end up in the form of leaf, which you separate from the plant anyways. You don't need that stalk and stem nearly as much.
Interesting. And see that's where like right now I'm really deep diving. I'm trying to find these style expressions in old school cultivars I have. It's like GMO brings it out, but I've got this skunk one I'm working with. Could something like carbon in particular work like a signaling molecule for like a gene expression in particular when we're talking thiols or bringing these certain expressions out, if we're really triggering that and we're dialing on these things? Like, would it be able to potentially trigger more terpene or thiol production?
Yeah, I mean, directly as a substrate, you could fit certain flavors of carbon. What carbon is kind of a Pandora's box. When I look at certain compounds, like let's just say we're looking at soil profiles, and I'm trying to figure out like what kind of phosphorus am I dealing with here. It depends on what other minerals. I could have magnesium phosphate, potassium phosphate's pretty soluble, so maybe the plants will take that up. There's calcium phosphate, which is bone meal. I don't have a whole lot of different. I have calcium carbonate maybe and calcium sulfate. My point is I have maybe like half a dozen or so different flavors of calcium or flavors of phosphorus that I can work into the soil. So for me to figure out how each one can get metabolized is not that complex. I mean, it is a little bit complex, but it's not a deal breaker. When we're looking at carbon, we're talking about hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of different compounds that are being produced. And some of them are derivatives of others. Some of them can be like partially broken down or modified in very, very minor ways. So a lot of times it's such a complex molecular soup that it's hard to just characterize carbon as doing one thing. A good example would actually be biochar. Biochar worked into the soils is not meant to be available for plants to take up. It's supposed to be this long chain, really hard to digest, cross-woven, interlinked network of carbon molecules that are all kind of coming together. They have physical properties for the soil. They have things like, they can increase the moisture retention capacity of the soil. They have charged groups so they can hold molecules closer, and via electrostatic attraction will actually bring minerals closer to it. But these are not things that actually work into the plant because these molecules are too big to actually get inside of the plant. So you've got your biochar and you've got your humic that works in terms of acting on physical properties of the soil and the physics of soil chemistry. But if you look at smaller fractions, really, really soluble, like fulvic acid fractions, for example, or organic acids like citrates and acetates, malates as well. Malic acid is a really important one. Those are so soluble and so small that they can pass through cell walls, and because they have chelation and complexing abilities, they'll pull minerals in and then drive them into the cells. That would be an example of something that you could foliar spray, and then the plants would probably absorb it almost entirely and immediately. But if you tried to foliar spray biochar on your plants, you'd be left with a pretty angry leaf surface. It would not absorb. So bioavailability of carbon is a huge factor. I always give the analogy of a lump of coal versus refined high octane race fuel. Like one of those is going to make your engine perform on an insane level, and the other is just going to sit around and not do much. And carbon is the exact same way. If you just take a lump of unrefined carbon and put it in the soil, it is probably going to contribute to some beneficial effects in the soil as far as the structuring and the physical properties go. But you may not see that big of a performance increase in the plants overall. Maybe incremental, but once you start feeding soluble carbon, that's the fuel injection directly into their engines, and they burn through that real quick, and it's very noticeable.
This FTS clip was brought to you by AC Infinity, leaders in garden innovation. Use discount code TheStash15 at checkout to save some money on your order.
From the Stash Podcast.